it's in this contemplative approach that we take. Once most, if not all, the doubts and obstacles that thought present have been explored. In other words, once our resistance at the level of the mind to this possibility has been at least largely eroded, we're then open to the deeper exploration at the level of the body, the level of our feelings. And that is, it's a little less, it's not quite so comfortable. You know, we love reading books, sitting in meetings, telling stories, and I don't mean that sarcastically. It's very enjoyable. It's very interesting. It's essential. But it's not, and can be profoundly challenging. But there's a whole other realm, which is to begin to allow these uncomfortable feelings, which we've so successfully kept at bay all our lives, to begin to percolate up into the light of awareness. And that is, as we were talking this morning, it's not always comfortable, because precisely the reason we have kept these feelings at bay is because they were so uncomfortable. They're often laid down early in childhood and simply buried because they're too painful. And we've developed strategies in our life, and we each have our different repertoire of strategies in which to successfully avoid feeling these feelings. And our strategies are usually a mixture of substances, activities, thoughts, relationships, etc. So the first stage of this deeper exploration often reveals layer upon layer of these uncomfortable feelings. And the conventional motivation is immediately to avoid them. And it's one of the subtle ways of avoiding them is by reading spiritual books and talking about spiritual things. You see, that's one way, not necessarily what's happening, but it can be one way the separate self appropriates the spiritual teaching just to go on thinking and talking about it. The talking school of Advaita. And this just becomes a new way, one of the separate self's more subtle ways of avoiding actually facing these deeper feelings. And as a result, the me feeling is able to, is perpetuated in the body. So that's why it's very good, for instance, when we're sitting here and there are no questions. And there's just an empty silence. And I'm sure many of us here have felt, if not in these silences, but in some period of silence, a slight discomfort. Oh, this silence is a bit awkward. What's the first thing we do to avoid the awkwardness of that silence? We start thinking. Thinking is perfect. We go off towards our summer holiday, or towards our bank account, or towards whatever it is. Perfect. As soon as we get engaged with the thought, we no longer have to feel the discomfort of the silence, which might be just a feeling of boredom. Just an innocuous feeling of boredom. In that feeling of boredom, which is a subtle resistance to the now, the separate self lives there. That's where its home is. It's one of its many homes, in just the feeling, this is boring. No one's asking a question. We're not getting anything. There must be more. There must be something. Just the separate self straining at the edges of the now. So those moments are very potent moments. Instead of avoiding the silence by going into thinking or manufacturing a question, or just to sit with the discomfort, allow the discomfort to come right up into the light of awareness, because underneath the discomfort there is another, even subtler, slightly less. The first layer of feeling we can label very cleanly boredom. We know this, it's called boredom. But underneath it, the feeling is not quite so obvious. It's just, I don't feel at ease. And then under that, there's an even less formula. And we go down through these layers. So That's the way to go. Allowing these layers of feeling in the body to percolate up to the surface. There is a metaphor that I often use, which many of you who have been to my meetings and retreats know about, so I apologize for telling it again, but it's such a good metaphor of the well, and that the sun shines above the well just for a brief period at noon every day. And at that moment the light shines all the way down to the bottom of the well, and the creatures at the bottom wake up because of the light of the sun, and they gravitate towards the light of the sun. Then the sun goes over and the creatures go back down to the bottom and fall asleep again. So that's a metaphor. So in that respect, we are like a well. The body is like a well of feelings. Only those feelings that are exposed to the light are the feelings that we're in contact with, that we're clearly definable. Boredom, loneliness, etc. But when the light of awareness shines over the well, but when we abide in this silent, empty presence, all the deeper feelings begin to percolate up to the surface. And if we're courageous, in other words, if we leave the sun of awareness shining down the well, they come up to the surface, they reveal themselves. Nothing more to be done to them. But just have the courage to stay with the discomfort of these feelings. That's the way to go.
I was going to ask that, can you try to bring them up through doing things that you are afraid of?
No, I don't recommend that.
Okay.
That is what. That is why. Let's put it like this. That's the unconscious way of dealing with them, if we can be permitted to use the word unconscious. When I say it's the unconscious way of dealing with, it's why people are, in most cases, interested in extreme sports and things like this. What they're really seeking is a means of evoking these deepest feelings, and the deepest feeling of all, the fear of death. That's the root form of the separate self. In fact, the separate self has two root forms, the sense of lack and the fear of death. So when you engage in extreme sports, you evoke the fear of death. You force that feeling out of hiding. But you force it out of hiding, but you don't really face it. You undertake your activity, the fear of death disappears again. You have a brief feeling of expansion when you're relieved of the fear of death. You think you've overcome the fear of death. You haven't, it's just gone to sleep again. You haven't really got rid of it. But there's a rush of energy when it leaves you, which is, we become addicted to that rush of energy. The release from the tension of fear. You become addicted to that. So then we engage in the activity again to get another shot of it, whether it's an activity or a substance. But it's all that's happening here is we're evoking the fear in order to get the pleasure of having the fear disappear again. But it doesn't really disappear, it just goes back down the well and goes to sleep at the bottom. So no, I wouldn't recommend that. It's not necessary. This is a very loving approach. It's a contemplative, loving approach to these things. Don't go after them. Let them come to you. Don't you go after them, because if you're going after them, you have to be careful that the separate self isn't slowly creeping back in, appropriating this, making it a spiritual practice that the separate self does to go after these feelings so I can drag them out of hiding and then crucify them. And all that's happening in this case is the separate self is just perpetuating itself by working on something in order to arrive at a goal. So no, it's a much more contemplative, loving approach. Let the feelings come to you. Don't go after them.
Very interesting and eye-opening. Thank you very much.
I once did when I was an art student, we had calligraphy calligraphy classes with a Japanese woman. And at the end of our class, I asked her if she'd do a piece of writing for me. And I still have the piece of writing hanging in my office now. She drew these 4 figures and gave it to me. And I asked her what it meant, and she said, "Run after beauty, beauty runs away. Run away from beauty, beauty runs after you."
Interesting.
Don't run after this experience. Stay put, stay where you are, stay the presence of awareness. Let experience come to you, don't go after it.